All right. So I'll start that. Today is going to be a slightly more laid back conversation. Our guest speaker, Tom Seitz, is going to be available on Wednesday. So he'll be logging in to talk to us about India. Tom is pretty fantastic. He has a lot of experience with people in India. He does a lot of business in India as opposed to necessarily straightforward academic study. He does that as well, but his just experience and an insight into some of the challenges that India faces is just second to none. So it's really nice to have him come in and be able to talk a little bit about that. So today we'll be talking a little bit about the government structure of India and how we got there. Um, Also, no PowerPoint today. Sorry, I opened up my folder and it's gone. I don't know where it went. My folder just skips from last week to Iran. So I figured you wouldn't want to see pictures of Iran while we're talking about India. So no PowerPoint today. We'll just have a discussion about India. But India is a former British colony. That should come as no surprise. It was under the British Empire for decades in its current form. And that really is most of the history that we need to jump from there into a discussion of how India looks today. Because their existence as a former colony is really determinant of how their government is formed and is also the source of a significant number of problems that India faces today. So to put that in perspective, India, upon its independence, adopted a constitution that looks extremely similar to the former government that had been installed by the British. So it is a Westminster system. It is a parliamentary system. While it doesn't have a leading executive in a monarch, it has a leading executive in a president. And so it looks very similar to the English system. And as we've talked about over the past couple of weeks, there are challenges that arise when a country has a constitution that is not entirely based on its own independent development of systems. The ones that we see nowadays that are truly, I guess, independent of that are generally what we consider to be the developing world. They are countries like China, which has not adopted full democracy, and so doesn't have that, sort of democratic recognition that a lot of countries expect. And yet that government has become extraordinarily successful, has remained extraordinarily stable in its control of China due to the fact that it is Chinese developed. And so India sits at this really interesting crossroads between the democracies of the world and the developing countries of the world. It's really hard to put India into one of these categories. If we go back to our, global north and global south kind of understanding of the world, India is generally considered to be part of the global south. It's in that band of countries that would be considered part of the global south. And so the implication of that you might get is not an inaccurate one. The struggles that India faces are many. They are economic, they are low literacy rates, they are poor sanitation, poor infrastructure development, a rapidly expanding population, as India is extremely well known for. All of these are issues that India faces, and yet at the same time, India also has this democratically elected government that looks like it should, in a democratic peace theory kind of approach, the democratic government looks like it should be able to move India forward in development, that it should be able to quote unquote solve these problems, as the expectation is for most democracies in the world. And so I think India is kind of that country that, if you buy into this whole democratic development theory that, every country should be democratic, India is probably one you kind of have to sweep under the rug to be able to justify that kind of approach to the world. It's yeah. So the issues that it faces are really something to focus on. You have these kind of juxtapositions that India faces. You have things like their, space program launching successful missions to put a satellite in orbit around Mars, which is obviously something that takes a great deal of technological advancement, and a great deal of money invested into these ventures. But you have that sitting at this odd crossroads where that serves as kind of a positive reflection on the success of their government intervention. It is a good sign for government in the world, right? If you can build a successful space program and launch successfully a satellite into orbit around Mars. While at the same time, there are literally sanitation issues around the headquarters of their space program, where they have, on public televisions most of the time, they have PSAs playing about how to properly discard of your feces, because that is something that India struggles with, is public sanitation. It is not uncommon for people to defecate on the streets in India. That is obviously extraordinarily unhealthy. And it is because of a lack of proper sanitation, a lack of proper facilities for people to do that. Most people are not wealthy enough to have access to private facilities, and public facilities are by and large failing because India has not invested a lot of money into rebuilding its infrastructure. And that is a necessity, because in India, the infrastructure that they do have is sort of the remnant technology from the industrialization period they underwent, which was under British rule. And it's not an exaggeration to say that Britain was imperializing more than it was colonizing, even though Britain did send people to live in India, and especially people to govern India. There was no intention to really fully colonize India at any point. And so the infrastructure that was built was not infrastructure for the benefit of the people. It was infrastructure for the benefit of Great Britain's economy. So you see things like, massive railway systems across India, that don't go between population areas, that don't serve individual transit or migration between different areas in India. Instead, you see their railway systems are built primarily around shipping out of the Indian Ocean so that goods can be sent to other countries for trade. It just gives this really fascinating juxtaposition between these two kinds of India. On the one hand, you have this very successful outward-facing democratic government, and on the other hand, you have what essentially 40 years ago was called a third world country, now fits into that developing nation kind of, stratagem, but still part of the global south, still with immense issues that it's very difficult to face. And it would be difficult for any government to face and to solve those kinds of issues. All of this is compounded by India's population. India is the second most populous country on the planet. They are just under 1.4 billion people at this point. And that is second only to China, which is just over 1.4 billion people. But you have probably seen or read, I think they even make mention of it in in the chapter in the book, that India is rapidly approaching, overtaking China as the most populous country in the world. And there are a couple of leading causes of that, but for the sake of our discussion, I want to put it out to you on what are some of the issues that come along with a rapidly growing population, and a population then that within the next few years will need more and more to sustain itself in India. So what are some of the issues that you might see with such a rapidly growing and massive population in India?
One thing that I can think of, this might not be like particularly related to India, but just massive growing population in general, is the lack of resources and more dependency on like imports.
Absolutely. That is very pertinent in India, as well as every other country with a growing population. You can depress, the growth rate of population, but we as a species are just not very well prepared to slow our growth rate as it is required to better utilize the resources that are accessible. And so, yes, Jacob, you have a very good point. India is struggling and will continue to struggle with resource usage. It is just unsustainable, especially when you reach the kind of numbers that India has. India, like I said, we're just under 1.4 billion people in India. Compare that, just for the sake of comparison, the United States has about 330 million people. And I think that there are parts of the United States where we see overcrowding, where we see the overusage of resources, where we see that just not as a factor necessarily of poverty, but as a factor of just accessibility, we see this problem that Jacob refers to, the resource scarcity, and basic resources, clean water, shelter, food, the absolute necessities for a basic quality of life are scarce in parts of the United States. Imagine that compounded 3 times over in India, and in extraordinarily concentrated urban areas, still some fairly diffuse rural areas, but obviously that is how all countries are at this point. And so, yeah, you run into resource scarcity problems that will affect everyone in the country. It affects those who are impoverished disproportionately, because obviously it is still a capitalist system. So those who can afford the resources, as their prices increase through inflation, will continue to do so. But those who are impoverished have ever decreasing access to the basic necessities of quality of life. I saw Anna, sorry, I apologize if it's Anna. I can't remember from when you used to be in class. And it said overcrowding and accompanying issues, health crises, for example. Absolutely. how do you possibly implement when you have that kind of population, when you have approximately 900 million adults in a country? How do you address any kind of health crises? It is impossible, and a recent good example of this, it is impossible for a country of that size to implement any kind of effective response to a pandemic. And that is something that has been, played out now, in the most unfortunate, experimental setting that we could imagine, where India was just ravaged by COVID. The best attempts of the government to mitigate and, attempt to vaccinate as much of its population as possible did very little to stem just the rapid inflation of that infected population. So it becomes extraordinarily difficult to address those major health crises, and even minor health crises. India does have a socialized medical program, and so you have all of the issues that can come with that and the combination of overcrowding. It is very common for you to be able to get, for an Indian resident to be able to get access to medical care only in the most dire of circumstances. Getting access for anything else can have extraordinarily long wait times, in the periods of days or weeks, often to get proper medical care. And so you have, a major issue that a democratic country is attempting to deal with in a logical democratic way, but it is complicated by this overcrowding. Reese also mentions that India has a large agricultural industry that is mostly tea driven. So yes, somewhat. It does have a few other, major resources that it exports, that are, driving this agricultural industry. But it is true. There is a question as to the degree to which India has truly industrialized. Obviously, that is something that, began, the process of industrialization began under British rule. And as to how successful that is, it really depends on what part of the country. If you look at the agricultural sector, there is a significant amount of India that still does not have, ready access to electricity. That is something that is not guaranteed in the more rural agricultural industrial parts of India. Now, is that a problem of industrialization? Is that a problem of necessity? Is that a problem of economy? All of those are possibilities, and all of those have an impact on this very large agricultural sector. However, important to note, as Reese does, that in India, we haven't seen as much of a move to purely urbanization type of industries. We have, India has maintained an extremely strong agricultural sector. And so where we see other countries, have an industrialization period after which we see a significant decrease in the agricultural industry, that might give rise to imports from other countries. India has tried to balance that, because they are using agricultural export as a pretty significant part of their revenue, for their economy. And so when you need to maintain that system of export, as well as experiencing, within the country, this, extreme levels of poverty, all of these issues that come along with this overpopulation, a draw on those same resources, it becomes a conflict of, how you are creating, the creating the foundation for effective exports while also ensuring the continued growth of your own people. And that again is a policy in a democracy kind of issue. Most democratic countries refuse or are extremely resistant to implementing any kind of state sponsored birth regulation. I'm delicately dancing around calling it birth control because obviously that has its own set of political problems that comes along with it. But when you look at a country like China, China has attempted to address its immense population by creating incentive programs to not have more than one child. Now, that insofar as addressing the problem of population has allowed China to slow its overall birth rate significantly enough that it isn't as overcrowded in as much of the country as India is. China also has a significantly larger amount of land on which to live. However, approximately 80% of China is considered uninhabitable because of the Gobi Desert. So different problems, not comparing India and China side by side in saying, I would not say that the way China has addressed its population problems would work in India. But you do see this difference. You see in a, this former communist country like China that is very comfortable with a rather authoritarian one-party system, you see the ability to implement programs like that, programs to slow the overall birth rate while attempting to address the death rate as well, to improve the overall quality of life for people in China, to extend those lives if possible, such that China has now has begun to flip in its graying population. And what we talk about a graying population, it is talking about the number of old people versus the number of young people, right? Usually used in business terms. So talking about the people within a country who are of working age. That varies country by country, but you're generally looking at the population of around, 18 to 60, 65-ish, somewhere in there. That is your working population. Those are the people who are considered to be of working age, can contribute to the country in in a very direct economic type of sense. And generally you want that population, for a country to succeed economically, you want that population to be larger than your graying population, which are the individuals over that retirement age, over the age of 60 or 65, who are no longer contributing as directly to the economy of your country. There are cultural reasons, very strong cultural reasons in both in both India and China, as well as Japan, another country that is now upside down on its graying population. There are very significant cultural reasons that, you don't tend to just let your elderly die. I think that there are cultural reasons in the United States as well that we tend to not like that as a policy. We want to take care of our elderly and provide for them so that they have an ongoing quality of life. It is in China and India, it is not viewed as much of a reward as I think we view it in the United States. I think that there's kind of this, exchange of like, you work hard for most of your life and then you retire and like you get to continue living well as a reward for all of the hard work that you did. That is going to come into conflict as we slowly eke away at the existence of Social Security. So that's its own set of problems in the United States. But that kind of view is not held as commonly in China and India. Instead, it is it is more of an expectation that individual families will maintain their elderly's quality of life, sometimes above even, those who are of working age. So whereas, in the United States, there's kind of this view of you work for yourself so that when you retire, you have a good life. In India, there's the view that you are working to give a good quality of life to your elders, to be able to support them and maintain their quality of life. So that differentiation in this context of extreme overpopulation, it makes it very difficult, because China has seen this flip where there are now we're starting to get to where there will be more elderly people than working age people. Japan has already reached that, and India has not. India is very much so still at a larger, younger population than its aging population. So you have, in some ways, the foundation for a very successful economic system, where you can produce enough strong economy to do things like send, missions to Mars. However, that's being done on the backs of this extensive labor force, which has fewer protections than you see in most other democratic countries. Fewer protections for the individual worker, fewer hiring protections, fewer protections for the employee as an individual unit in India. So yeah, significant problems that come along with this overpopulation, and not easy things to solve, because, as I said, you can try China's model, you can try encouraging fewer births, and then you risk flipping, the graying population over your working population, and that brings with it its own economic, societal issues that will then need to be addressed as well. So not an easy solution. Yeah. Questions, thoughts beyond that on India's population growth?
As far as I understand it, the caste system in India also plays a role in the extreme poverty and the acceptance of the inequalities, just because, like, if I'm not mistaken, there's like several different levels of the caste system, and most of the population is in the lower part. And so then the rich and powerful at the top can claim, and the poor people believe them, that, oh, well, I was better than you in a previous life, so you deserve to be where you are, and I deserve to be where I am, and there's nothing you can do about it. And unfortunately, that's a very common belief in India. And so then that kind of bars a lot of movements to basically make things better in people's lives. Like, people don't feel the need, because they're like, oh, well, I was bad in the previous life, so I deserve this. This is a punishment. My job is to serve the people above me and nothing else. And so it's kind of a bit of a doom loop, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that definitely plays a role in the vast inequalities and, problems that most of the people in India, face on an everyday basis. So
Sure. Absolutely. And the continued existence of the caste system is controversial, and also very apparently contributing to these ongoing issues that India faces, because the caste system was officially disbanded under the Constitution. Now, does that mean that it is effectively disbanded? Absolutely not. The caste system still exists almost as strongly as it did. No longer reinforced by the government officially. So like there is a little bit less stringent pressure placed on the caste system when it comes to things like economic development, but it's still there. the caste system still exists. Most people in India still consider the caste system to be in place, because it is, not just a tradition, but a baked in facet of Indian culture, that is, again, really, I think, necessary to understand, and necessary to understand not in the context of it seems like it's a bad thing, because I think often we can look at the caste system and say, well, obviously there are reasons that for a democratic society, they sought to move past that. We consider something like individual mobility, economic mobility, to be an essential facet of, the American dream, the democratic process. I think, generally think of that as something that you need to have in a democratic system. And yet that all kind of ignores the strengths that are provided to a society by the caste system. Knowing, essentially having a societal structure in which there is a strong designation of your position in society helps to build a very strong societal identification, and helps to build adherence to the government, helps to build contentment, for a lot of people. Obviously, there are some religious influences here, as Rowan mentioned, as Hindu is the predominant religion in India. However, there are other religions present in India, as we discussed a little bit earlier this semester when we talked about Bangladesh, and the issues that we've had between Pakistan and Bangladesh, being essentially an attempt to excise all of the Muslims from India. There is a strong Muslim presence in India. There's also a significant and growing Christian population in India. So you have this system that was, is pretty identifiable with one of the primary religions in India, but also then has this interplay and interacts with these other religious beliefs that exist at the same time. So yes, you have the remnants, very present, the remnants of this caste system, that are still influencing Indian politics. And most of the people that are in the General Assembly, either in the upper or lower house, I guess we can talk about the Indian structure a little bit more, but most of the people in the houses are in fact members of the upper castes. They are either I'm trying to remember or find it in my notes. I know the highest caste is the Brahmin, the lowest caste is untouchable, which they very much so try not to use that word anymore. That's what it used to be. Now it's generally just kind of the others of society. It's it is a very strict system that is still in play and still influences their politics. So yeah, that is another significant aspect to consider when we're looking at this and how that is at play in the structure of their society and their government, and its reinforcement of some of these major issues. Other thoughts, things? Yeah, Reese?
Yeah, bit of a dumb question, but how does the caste system stay intact? Like, how do other people know what caste you are, especially if you move? Because obviously it's a lot easier to get around now than it was 200 years ago. And
Sure. Mostly through family inheritance. It is the caste system's biggest influence is not the title of which caste you are in. It's where you fall, where your family falls on an economic scale. So it is, I still, I would argue, I would say that in the United States, economic mobility is still very difficult for most people, right? That is not something that is strongly reinforced by the government. So that, that means that in the United States, at least, we don't have a strong institutionalized caste system. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some kind of caste system still in existence, because it is very difficult in India, especially, but also somewhat in the United States. It's very difficult to change economic status from those who come before you. You can imagine how that's made more difficult in India by what I was just talking about with the strict adherence to family support. That as a working adult, you have a responsibility to, support your elderly. And that's, a family-wide type of concept or type of responsibility. So it becomes very difficult to move castes, to change essentially where in society you fall, looking at that from this sort of very segregated economic bracket. It's very difficult to become a millionaire if you grow up in the middle class, right? To kind of put it in American terms, even though the middle class kind of doesn't exist anymore. There's like poverty plus, and then millionaires. But it's very difficult to do that, especially when we do have in the United States some, some of the get rich stories, the technological developments. If you build a really great app, you might become a millionaire, like, out of whatever beginnings you have. We have more positions that can be mobile like that, and we really like to capitalize on those kind of success stories. But there is that ability to be mobile, and at least the narrative of being able to be mobile. That's probably part of why you go to college, is because you want to get a good job that pays fairly well. That isn't necessarily the case in India. It is much harder to access, and again, this applies not just to India, but to a great number of countries that are in that developing category. It becomes extremely difficult to access that kind of individual economic success that would move you from one caste to another. So, if you're able to move, you don't have to state, it's your caste isn't on your ID card in India. However, the amount of money that you have, the type of job that you have, what you have experience in, all of those things are still very caste bound. And we see, there is a sort of narrative of, moving to United States to escape that type of caste system. Moving to a different country in which it is easier to find some mobility, that may exceed that caste system that is still strongly in place. Rowan, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, there's I was just gonna mention it. There's a really good movie on Netflix that came out about a year or two ago, something like that. It's called The White Tiger, and it's about India and the caste system, and about how this guy, I think he was like just above the untouchables, or maybe a couple above the untouchable level in the cat, like unofficially, like and so like he's a driver for rich people, and he's treated like like a piece of shit basically. And he comes across like I think, what does he do? He like murders, he murders the rich person, steals a bag of money, and then becomes a Brahmin by stealing a rich person's money. And so it just, the whole moral of the story is that the caste system is really about money. So if you have money, then you can get out of it. And he ends up becoming rich and powerful off of this one bag of $1 million, basically. And so, and he was smart with it too, and he was a really smart person. But basically, yeah, it's a really good movie. If anyone hasn't seen it, it's a pretty good representation of how stuff works in India, and definitely opened my eyes. I knew it was bad, but after watching that movie, I was like, whoa, that's really bad.
Yep. Yeah, it is definitely a strong influencing factor on the ongoing political and economic crises that that India faces. So don't murder someone to get rich. I think that's a good moral to maybe finish the class on. I don't know if we can get much more up than that.
I don't really blame him. I kind of envy. If I was in that situation, I don't know if I would be able to have the restraint, but that's just
Fair
me.
enough. All right, so don't murder people and don't hire Rowan as your driver if you
I don't condone murder. I'll say that.
All right. Any other questions to finish out today? Like I said, we will have Tom here on Wednesday, and I'm very much so looking forward to you getting a chance to talk with him about how all of this then plays out and looks in India. But any final questions, thoughts? All right, excellent. Goodbye. See you on Wednesday.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.